Okay, welcome everyone to another video brought to you by chess.com. I am FM Daniel Rensch, and here we go. So today what we're going to do is we're going to start with some of the, I would call them more practical positions, and what I mean by that is that they occur in practice, and I think a lot of their ideas, even if you don't reach these exact positions we're going to look at today, can be applied in practice. Okay, so let's jump right in. What we're looking at here is a position where, although white is actually up 2 pawns, this is a theoretical draw. We're just going to go ahead and tell you the answer right now, that this position is a theoretical draw. And the reason for that is because as long as black controls the A file, he's preventing white's rook from moving out from in front of the pawn. And the only way that white would ever be able to free that would be to bring the king over to at some point release the pressure of the rook. Only one problem with that is that if he ever even gets close, we could start checking him now if we're black, or we can even wait one more move. If he ever even gets close, the checks begin, and the checks can either continue if we choose for them to, or we can go back and get right back in front of the pawn, and we're still preventing white from making progress. Now, the reason why I have this little extra pawn over here on the board is for a good reason. Not even though we started out trying to illustrate the problem with having the pawn on the 7th rank, because the king has nowhere to hide from the checks. And the reason why we have this extra pawn, as I was saying, is that it doesn't even change the situation. One of the interesting things about these positions is that as long as black can maintain his king between the h7 and g7 squares, white has no way to make progress. So let's say he even tried to push this pawn, and let's move our rook, and he continues to try to push and even gets all the way down to the 6th rank. You'll notice that that doesn't change black's defense in the slightest. Black is still simply needing to keep control over the A file, which thus prevents the white rook from moving out. And even having this extra pawn doesn't make a difference. So we might be asking, well, what if we started out with a corner pawn? Well, you can probably figure out the answer for yourself that that doesn't really change the position, because a corner pawn doesn't have this. It has the same disadvantages that a knight pawn does, which is that it doesn't force the king away from one of these 2 squares. We're going to get to why the king needs to be away from one of those 2 squares in a second, and you may already know the trick, but you'll notice that even having a corner pawn doesn't change the situation in the slightest either, because black does not have to move away from the 7th rank, and he does not have to move away from those 2 squares. In either case, if he ever moved away from the 7th rank, either by coming as far as the 6th, white would always be able to remove this rook with tempi, as we call, with a tempo check, allowing the pawn to queen. And if the king ever moved away from these 2 7th rank squares, let's say to f7, here we would have an easy queen by pushing the pawn. But even without that being the case, one of the famous tricks about this position is that if the king cannot maintain control of the corner, white has the backdoor trick, the backdoor rook trick. The rook is able to swing across the board, threatening to get a queen. And after the pawn is captured, he wins the rook by coming to the other side of the board. And I've actually seen very strong players, including masters, forget about that trick during games, where let's say they were in a position to start with where they understood that the king needed to stay on the 7th rank, because they knew that if the king came to the 6th rank, there would be a check with tempi. But even strong players have forgotten about this tactic of the backdoor trick with the rook. Now, this is a very basic position that illustrates this idea. So I don't think I've never seen a master forget about it in such a basic position. However, when we start to make these positions more practical, as this lesson is called, Practical Positions 1, which means we're going to start adding more pieces on the board and get a little bit more complicated, you're going to notice that some of these basic ideas, things like needing to keep the king in the corner, needing to keep the king safe from checks, will find themselves repeating even in more practical and complicated positions. So with that being said, let's review real quick about what the basic ideas were from this position. Again, having a knight or a rook pawn does not change the fact that this is a theoretical draw, because black is not forced to move his king away from these squares. The rook can simply wait. Even the king can wait back and forth if he wants. But by making waiting moves with the rook, white will not have any progress to be made at some point because his king has nowhere to shield himself from checks. Even if he makes the long journey all the way over to the queen side, he's unable to shield himself from the black checks. So pretty basic to understand, although I think that a lot of players don't just know this position. This is one of those positions you just need to know. You need to just know that if a pawn reaches the 7th rank, typically these positions cannot be won because of the fact that the king isn't really threatening anything. So with that being said, we're going to move right ahead to, as I said, slightly more practical positions. Let's move right ahead to a position, one that I think is always good to start with. And that is a position where we have an equal scenario on one side of the board, while one of the players has an advantage on the other side of the board, in this case being one extra pawn. Here is a basic position where we see that if white pushes this pawn to the 7th rank, although we've added more material, that theoretical idea I just showed in the last position applies here as well, which is that now that this pawn has moved to the 7th rank, black really has nothing to worry about. You could move the rook if you wanted to, or you could even extend the pawn. This is typically a very effective setup, and we're going to talk about in a later position, we're going to talk about why opening the king here is not always such a good idea. We'll come back to that. So you could do a number of things here, move a pawn and even allow white to start making some progress here, because as we know that even though our rook can't ever move off and take these pawns, we'd like to take those, but we can't because he'll queen. But even though we can't do that, it's okay because he's not threatening anything over on the queen side. When the king ever gets close, we start our checks, and we could give a few more checks if we want to be annoying, or you can even just go right back and guard the pawn and remind white that there's really no progress to be made in this position, which is why a lot of the time if you see grandmasters start out in a position like this, you might even just see them just agree to a draw right off the bat, because they both understand where the position is headed, not because they've calculated 50 moves, but because they understand that the idea is pretty simple. Now, why did I start out with a position with the pawn on the 6th rank? You might be wondering. Well, the reason is it does illustrate one other idea. Now, with the pawn on the 6th rank, what option does white have that he didn't have before? If you want to take a second to pause and figure that out, you can. Okay, we're going to assume you're back, but the basic idea here is actually very simple, which is that now when the king comes over, he does have the option at some point to hide. However, what's the obvious problem with the fact that the pawn is on the 6th rank? Well, with the pawn on the 6th rank, my rook is not totally tied down yet. In fact, I have the option of possibly taking. So even if you waited as long as you possibly could before you made that decision, it's very risky to do that. Let's say we even save our h-pawn, and let's say black's not even aggressive. Let's say he doesn't even try to do too much. Let's say he just kind of sits on the position over here. Eventually, you'll have to make one of these moves where you have to start giving up a pawn. You could even try to push here, but then the 3rd rank becomes a problem. So let's say at some point white decided that he wanted to make a win of this position instead of a draw, and decided to take that risk. Well, that now, as you see, black can munch. And pushing to the 7th rank only allows me to come back, and now you're in the same position you were in before, where you're not threatening to make progress because your king can't hide, and you've actually lost the pawn, which means you can't do that. You have to continue to make the risk, and so I'll come up again. And here, once again, the same problem. You can't push here because I'll come back behind the pawn, so you have to continue to take this risk with the king, and all of a sudden you start to recognize that even here with the king on b6, you can't push the pawn first because, once again, I'll give a check and get behind this pawn, and white is unable to make progress, and now you've actually lost 2 pawns. So here you've taken the risk of giving up 2 pawns, all to have the ability to move this rook out and now start to threaten to get this queen and possibly shield your king. But even coming that far is not enough to guarantee a win. In fact, at this point, at this point, it's likely you could even lose this position if black starts pushing himself, puts his rook behind the pawn, and even in a best case scenario for white, where he's forcing black to sacrifice his rook for the pawn because of the threat of rook a6, after which white would be able to get a queen uncontested. So black sacrifice, but even here, it doesn't take much calculation to figure out that black has at least a draw here because white will have to give up his rook for the pawn. And in some cases, you know, maybe who knows, maybe black is able to play for a win with a push of the pawn. But at the very least, you would see him come up and force a sacrifice of the rook and head to a drawn king and pawn ending because white's king is close enough to the pawn. So, okay, I think we went a little bit faster. Let me back up and kind of reaffirm those ideas. The basic problem with a position with an outside passed pawn, especially when the defender has gotten his rook in the optimal situation, which is always behind the pawn. That's always the optimal defensive position. The basic problem is that with the pawn on the 6th rank, you're not really threatening enough to keep the rook tied down to the pawn. So if you start to make progress, my rook will threaten some chaos on this side of the board. So basically, in order to try to win, you have to risk losing, as we just saw in the other game. And in some cases, you will lose. And pushing the pawn to the 7th rank, although it certainly doesn't risk losing because my rook is always stuck, you now have almost 0 winning chances as long as I'm aware of the fact that I don't have to do anything. I can just sit, and if your king ever comes over, I'm going to start giving checks at some point. You'd be surprised how many times I've seen a position like this, and the defender freaks out and starts advancing his situation and freaking out and doesn't even take the time to realize the fact that white is not threatening anything. So eventually he creates a position where he's actually created principle of 2 weaknesses. He's created another problem on this side of the board. So then at some point, you know, let's say he tries to bring the king over. At some point, you know, white takes advantage of the fact that that he can come over and possibly start winning these guys instead of trying to queen this pawn. You know, now maybe he goes over here and wins some weaknesses on this side of the board, and black realizes that he may be lost now because of his extension of those pawns. So I believe it really is an important point. In fact, 2 of my students did an exact example of that the other day at a tournament where, you know, they extended, you know, the black side did not realize that white was not really threatening to make any progress in a position like this, and he extended his kingside pawns to the point where they became weaknesses and lost the game. So again, this is why we call this a practical session, because even though there are some very technical ideas, like you have to have your rook behind the pawn, and understanding the easy theory that if the pawn is on the 7th rank, white is really not threatening anything, and that if the pawn is on the 6th rank, you have a very technical idea of just creating threats on this side of the board. Those are things that you need to remember and you need to lock into your brain. But, you know, a good practical point is that, you know, if you're under time pressure, would you keep a cool head and remember those ideas? I hope you would. And remember that generally the worst thing you can do is extend your kingside pawns to the point where they become weaknesses themselves. A lot of players make that mistake. And when he already has an advantage like this, you will most of the time lose those games if you extend those pawns too far. So that ends our first session today, which is practical rook endings 101, we'll call it. You know, that'd be fun. Practical rook endings 101, like a college class. So please take some of the patterns here, some of the ideas, and try to apply them in your games. Very simple understanding of the fact that these outside passed pawns over here are not quite as effective. These outside passed pawns over here are not quite as effective as they always look. Very good and important point to be aware of. So thank you, and that ends our video for the day. Good luck.